My daughter deleted the CCTV footage that could have saved us from ruin. She looked me straight in the eye and erased the evidence of her $1 million scam. I gave birth to a stranger. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning, I wake to the gray light filtering through my small apartment in the Bronx, the familiar hum of the subway rattling below my feet like a heartbeat I've grown to despise. My slippers, worn thin from years of shuffling across the same linoleum floor, whisper against the cold surface as I make my way to the kitchen. The scent of old coffee mingles with the sharp smell of disinfectant, a combination that has become the signature of my loneliness. My routine is a tired echo of what life used to be. I check the mailbox first, my arthritic fingers trembling as I sort through bills I can barely afford to pay. The numbers on those white envelopes mock me, reminding me of choices I never thought I'd have to make at 73. Do I pay the electricity bill or buy my diabetes medication? Do I skip another meal to keep the heat on, or do I call my daughter, again, begging for help that never comes? The walls of my apartment are lined with faded family photographs, faces frozen in happier times. There's Sarah at her high school graduation, her smile so bright it could power the entire building. There she is again at 25, holding the keys to her first apartment in Los Angeles, her eyes full of dreams and promises. And there's the last photo we took together 5 years ago, before everything changed, before I became nothing more than a number in her phone that she rarely bothers to answer. For years, I believed those photographs told a story of love, of sacrifice, of a family held together through storms. I convinced myself that the distance between us was just geography, that her silence was just the busy life of a successful businesswoman. But today, as I stare at those same pictures, betrayal hangs thick in the stale air of my apartment like smoke I can't escape. Last Tuesday, I sent Sarah a simple text message. My fingers, swollen from arthritis, struggled with the tiny keys of my old phone. Honey, would you like to come over for dinner this weekend? I'll make your favorite pot roast. I waited. The dots appeared and disappeared. Then nothing. No reply. No excuse. Just the crushing weight of silence that has become our relationship. This wasn't the first time. My birthday passed 3 months ago without so much as a phone call. Mother's Day came and went with the kind of quiet that echoes through your bones. I told myself it was just life, that people grow busy, that success demands sacrifice. But deep in my chest, something twisted and burned every time I defended her absence to my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who still receives weekly calls from all 4 of her children. The real alarm bells started ringing when I received our joint bank statement last month. You see, when Sarah moved to Los Angeles 12 years ago, chasing those Hollywood dreams that seemed so important to her, I co-signed on several accounts to help her get started. Just until I'm established, Mom, she'd said, her voice honey-sweet over the phone. You know how hard it is for young entrepreneurs. But the numbers on that statement made no sense. There were transactions I didn't recognize, transfers I never authorized, and a pattern of withdrawals that made my blood run cold. Her supposed small marketing business was moving amounts of money that seemed impossible for a company I'd never seen succeed. The reality beneath those smiling photographs, the warmth of her hugs in my memory, clashed cruelly with the cold, hard numbers printed in black and white. I remember the day she first asked me for money like it was yesterday. She'd been in Los Angeles for 6 months, sharing a cramped apartment with 3 other girls, all of them trying to make it in entertainment. Mom, I have this incredible opportunity, she'd said during one of our weekly phone calls. There's this established marketing company that wants to bring me on as a partner, but I need to invest $25,000 to buy into the business. $25,000. My entire savings account at the time, money I'd scraped together from 30 years of working double shifts as a home health aide, caring for elderly patients who couldn't care for themselves. I'd skipped vacations, worn the same winter coat for a decade, and eaten more canned soup than any human should have to, all to build that nest egg that was supposed to keep me secure in my old age. But she was my daughter. My only daughter. And when she spoke about her dreams, her voice carried the same excitement I remembered from when she was 7 years old, telling me she was going to be a movie star. How could I say no? Are you sure about this, Sarah? I'd asked, my hand trembling as I held the phone. That's a lot of money, honey. Mom, you don't understand, she'd replied, and I could hear that edge creeping into her voice, the impatience that appeared whenever anyone questioned her judgment. This is an investment. In 2 years, I'll be able to pay you back 10 times over. Don't you trust me? Trust. That word would haunt me for years to come. I withdrew the money the next day, my heart pounding as I signed the withdrawal slip. The bank teller, a kind woman named Patricia who'd known me for years, looked concerned. That's a significant amount, Mrs. Chen. Are you sure everything's all right? I forced a smile and lied. Just helping my daughter with her business. The wire transfer went through that afternoon. Sarah called me that evening, her voice bubbling with gratitude and excitement. Mom, you're amazing. I love you so much. This is going to change everything for both of us. For a few months, everything seemed fine. She'd call regularly, updating me on her progress, telling me about meetings and clients and all the wonderful things happening with her new venture. She sent photos of herself in professional clothes, standing in front of impressive office buildings, looking every inch the successful businesswoman I'd always dreamed she'd become. But then the calls became less frequent. The updates grew vague. And when I asked specific questions about the business, about when I might expect to see some return on my investment, she'd change the subject or suddenly remember an urgent appointment she had to rush to. 6 months later, she called again. This time, her voice was different, stressed, tired, with an undertone of panic that made my maternal instincts kick into high gear. Mom, I need to ask you for another favor. My heart sank. What kind of favor, sweetheart? The business is doing really well, but we have this amazing opportunity to expand, and I need another $15,000. Just temporarily. I'll pay you back with interest within 6 months, I promise. I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, seeing an old woman whose savings account was already stretched thin from the first loan. Sarah, I don't have that kind of money just sitting around. What about your retirement fund? You could take a loan against it. The casualness with which she suggested I mortgage my future made my stomach turn. Honey, that money is supposed to take care of me when I'm too old to work. But Mom, and now her voice took on that wheedling tone I remembered from her teenage years, you're already retired. You've got Social Security and your pension from the hospital. And if this business takes off like I know it will, you'll never have to worry about money again. Against every instinct in my body, I said yes. Again. The pattern repeated itself over the next 4 years. Every 8 to 10 months, Sarah would call with some new emergency, some fantastic opportunity, some temporary setback that just required a little more financial support to overcome. The amounts varied, sometimes $5,000, sometimes $20,000, once a staggering $35,000 that required me to take out a second mortgage on my apartment. Each time, I told myself it would be the last time. Each time, I convinced myself that this was what mothers do. We sacrifice for our children, we believe in their dreams even when the evidence suggests we shouldn't. Each time, Sarah made promises about repayment that never materialized. Meanwhile, my own life was shrinking. I stopped going out to dinner with friends because I couldn't afford it. I canceled my cable subscription, then my newspaper, then my magazine subscriptions. I started shopping at discount grocery stores, buying generic brands and day-old bread. My arthritis medication became a luxury I could only afford every other month. The worst part wasn't the financial strain, though that was crushing. The worst part was the slow realization that I was becoming invisible to my own daughter. Our phone conversations, when they happened at all, followed a predictable script. She'd spend maybe 2 minutes asking about my health or my activities, then launch into detailed accounts of her busy, important life in Los Angeles. The marketing business had apparently morphed into some kind of consulting firm, then into a talent management company, then into something involving real estate development that I never quite understood. She'd drop names of celebrities she claimed to work with, mention exclusive parties and important meetings, paint a picture of success and sophistication that should have made me proud but somehow only made me feel more distant from the daughter I'd raised. And when she needed money, the conversation would shift. Suddenly, I became important again, valuable, worth her full attention. She'd tell me she loved me, remind me of all the sacrifices she knew I'd made, promise that this time would be different, this time the investment would pay off for both of us. I started keeping a notebook, writing down the dates and amounts of every loan, every promise, every conversation. Looking at those numbers written in my careful handwriting was like watching my life drain away $1 at a time. The turning point came last spring, during what I now think of as the emergency that broke my faith in my daughter forever. Sarah called on a Thursday evening, sobbing. My heart immediately went into panic mode. Was she hurt? Sick? In some kind of trouble? Mom, something terrible has happened, she wailed into the phone. There's been a mistake with the business accounts, and the IRS is saying we owe hundreds of thousands in back taxes. They're going to freeze everything unless I can come up with $50,000 by Monday. $50,000. The largest amount she'd ever requested, and she needed it in 4 days. Sarah, I don't have that kind of money, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I've already borrowed against everything I own. What about Dad's life insurance policy? She asked, referring to the $20,000 policy that was literally the only financial security I had left in the world. My husband had died 15 years earlier, and that insurance money was supposed to cover my funeral expenses and maybe leave a small inheritance for Sarah and her brother Michael. It was sitting in a savings account, untouched, because I knew that once it was gone, I'd have nothing left to leave behind, no legacy except debt and disappointed dreams. Honey, that money is supposed to be for what, Mom? You're not dead yet. And if this business goes under, if I lose everything, what kind of inheritance will that be for Michael and me anyway? The way she said, "You're not dead yet," made my blood turn to ice. There was something cold in her voice, something calculating that I'd never heard before. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my daughter saw me as a person or just as a resource to be exploited. But the tears in her voice seemed real, and the desperation felt genuine, and I was still her mother, still programmed to fix whatever was broken in her world. I cashed in the life insurance policy on Friday. The money was wired to Sarah's account on Monday morning. She called that afternoon, her voice bright with relief and gratitude, promising that everything would be fine now, that the crisis was over, that she'd start paying me back just as soon as the business got back on stable footing. That was 8 months ago. I haven't received a penny in repayment, and our conversations have dwindled to maybe once every 6 weeks, usually when she needs something small, help with a utility bill, money for car repairs, assistance with some minor financial emergency that always seems to require exactly the amount I can least afford to give. The isolation became unbearable. Mrs. Rodriguez would invite me to join her family for dinner, and I'd have to decline because I was too embarrassed to admit I couldn't afford to bring anything to contribute. My old friends from the hospital would suggest meeting for coffee, and I'd make excuses because I couldn't even afford a cup of coffee at the diner where we used to gather every Tuesday. I started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, waking up with my heart racing and my sheets soaked in sweat, terrified about how I was going to pay for groceries or utilities or the increasing pile of medical bills that seemed to multiply every month. And through it all, Sarah continued to post photos on social media, pictures of herself at expensive restaurants, wearing clothes that cost more than my monthly budget, taking elaborate vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. The breaking point came 3 months ago, on a Tuesday that started like any other but ended with the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my daughter. I'd been having chest pains for weeks, the kind that make you wonder if this is how it ends, alone in a small apartment with no one to find your body for days. I finally worked up the courage to call Sarah, thinking that maybe, if I was really sick, really in trouble, she'd put aside whatever she was doing and be my daughter again. "Mom, can this wait?" she answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted and impatient. "I'm in the middle of a really important meeting." "I've been having some health issues," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I might need to see a cardiologist, but my insurance has a high deductible and, look, Mom, you know I'd love to help, but things are really tight right now. We're in the middle of this huge expansion, and every dollar is tied up in the business. Can't you work out a payment plan with the doctor?" Something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked, like ice on a pond when the temperature drops too fast. "Sarah, I've given you over $200,000 in the last 4 years. Silence on the other end of the line. "I know, Mom, and I'm grateful, I really am. But that money was invested in the business. It's not like I spent it on shoes or something. This is our future I'm building. Our future. When had my daughter's dreams become our future? And when had our future stopped including my present needs?" That night, I did something I'd never done before. I called my son Michael in Chicago and told him everything. Every loan, every broken promise, every sleepless night spent worrying about money I didn't have. Michael listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions that made it clear he had no idea how much money Sarah had taken from me over the years. "Mom, why didn't you tell me what was going on?" "Because I was ashamed. Because I was embarrassed. Because admitting that my daughter was using me meant admitting that maybe I'd been a fool to trust her, to believe in her, to sacrifice my security for her dreams. I wanted to help her succeed," I said, my voice small and broken. "At what cost? Mom, you could have died from those chest pains, and you were worried about a medical bill while Sarah's posting pictures of herself at some spa in Malibu." That's when Michael told me something that made my world tilt sideways. "Mom, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Sarah's been borrowing money from me too. Not as much as what you've given her, but substantial amounts. And last month, she asked me to co-sign on a business loan for $500,000. My daughter was systematically draining everyone in the family. The next morning, I went to the bank and asked to see the records for all the accounts where Sarah's name appeared. What I discovered made me physically sick. The business she described to me, the marketing company that had supposedly grown into a consulting firm and then a talent agency and then a real estate venture, didn't exist. Not as she described it, anyway. Instead, there were dozens of transactions that looked like money laundering, payments to and from companies with names I didn't recognize, transfers that happened in patterns that suggested something more complex and more sinister than a failed business venture. When I asked Patricia, my longtime bank teller, to help me understand what I was looking at, her face went pale. Mrs. Chen, these transactions, they look like someone is running multiple businesses under different names, moving money around to avoid detection. You might want to speak to someone in our fraud department. Fraud. The word echoed in my head like a gunshot in an empty building. My daughter wasn't just a failure as an entrepreneur. She wasn't just financially irresponsible or overly optimistic about her business prospects. My daughter was a criminal. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the bank statements spread across my little table like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Every transaction told a story of deception, every deposit and withdrawal evidence of a lie she'd told me, a promise she'd made with no intention of keeping. I thought about calling her, confronting her, demanding an explanation. But what would be the point? I already knew she'd deny everything, twist the facts, make it somehow my fault for not understanding the sophisticated business world she operated in. Instead, I called Michael back and told him what I'd learned. We need to report this to the police, he said immediately. But I couldn't. Not yet. She was still my daughter. The little girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms, who cried when her pet goldfish died, who hugged me so tight on her first day of kindergarten that I had to pry her arms from around my neck. Somewhere inside the woman who had stolen from me, used me, discarded me, was the child I'd loved more than my own life. For 2 weeks, I carried the knowledge like a stone in my chest. Every day, I'd wake up hoping it had been a nightmare, that somehow the numbers would make sense, that there would be an innocent explanation for what looked like organized fraud. And then Sarah called. Mom, I have incredible news. Her voice was bright with excitement, the way it used to be when she was little and wanted to share some small triumph from school. What's that, sweetheart? I asked, the endearment feeling like ash in my mouth. The business is finally taking off. I mean really taking off. We just landed this huge contract with a major studio, and they're paying us $1 million up front. Can you believe it? Your investment is finally going to pay off. $1 million. I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, seeing only a tired old woman who'd been played for a fool. That's wonderful, Sarah. When do you think you might be able to start paying me back? Well, that's the thing. We need to reinvest most of this money back into the business to handle the increased workload. But I should be able to send you something in a few months. Maybe around Christmas. Another promise. Another delay. Another lie. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. I called a lawyer. David Morrison was a young attorney who specialized in elder fraud, and when I explained my situation, his voice grew increasingly grim. Mrs. Chen, what you're describing sounds like a classic family member financial exploitation case. The fact that your daughter has access to joint accounts and has been systematically draining your resources over several years makes this particularly serious. But she's my daughter, I said, as if that explained everything. I understand. These are the hardest cases for families to deal with because the emotional relationship complicates the legal issues. But you need to understand that what she's done to you isn't just morally wrong, it's criminal. Mr. Morrison explained that elder financial abuse was a felony in New York State, punishable by significant prison time and restitution requirements. He outlined the steps we'd need to take to protect my remaining assets and potentially recover some of what had been stolen. But first, he said, we needed evidence. Do you have any documentation of these transactions? Any written promises about repayment? Any record of the lies she's told you about the business? I thought about my notebook, filled with dates and amounts and broken promises. I thought about the bank statements, the wire transfer receipts, the emails where Sarah had outlined various business ventures that apparently didn't exist. I have some things, I said. Good. We'll also need to gather evidence about her actual business activities. Do you know where she works? Have you ever visited her office? I realized that in all the years Sarah had been in Los Angeles, I'd never actually seen her workplace. Every time I'd suggested visiting, she'd made excuses. The office was being renovated, she was working from client sites, she was traveling too much to make a visit worthwhile. I've never seen where she works, I admitted. Mr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to do some investigating. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. Janet Kowalski was a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. When I explained what I'd discovered about Sarah's bank activities, she nodded grimly. How much do you know about what your daughter actually does for a living? She's told me about various businesses over the years, but honestly, I've never completely understood what she does. Let me see if I can find out. 3 days later, Janet called with news that made my legs go weak. Sarah wasn't running a marketing business, or a consulting firm, or a talent agency. She was operating what appeared to be an elaborate Ponzi scheme, taking money from investors with promises of huge returns on entertainment industry projects that didn't exist. Your daughter has been under investigation by the FBI for the last 6 months, Janet told me. She's been using at least a dozen different business names and has defrauded investors out of an estimated $1.2 million. $1.2 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. The reason she keeps asking you for money isn't to grow a legitimate business, Janet continued. It's to pay earlier investors just enough to keep them from getting suspicious while she looks for new victims. I hung up the phone and vomited. The daughter I'd raised, the little girl I'd read bedtime stories to, the teenager I'd sat up nights worrying about when she was late getting home from dates, was a professional criminal. And I wasn't just her victim, I was her accomplice. Every dollar I'd sent her had been used to perpetuate the fraud, to steal from other families, other elderly parents who trusted their children the way I'd trusted mine. That evening, alone in my small apartment, I looked at those family photographs on my walls and felt like a stranger was staring back at me from every frame. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind to what she really was? I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the years, looking for signs I'd ignored, red flags I'd dismissed as maternal worry. The vague descriptions of her work, the name-dropping that never quite added up, the lifestyle that seemed too expensive for someone whose business was supposedly just getting started, it all made terrible sense now. The next morning, Sarah called. Mom, I have a favor to ask. I almost laughed. Of course she did. I need you to make me an authorized user on your credit cards. Just temporarily. There's this payment we need to make, and our business cards are maxed out, but we'll have the money to pay you back next week. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The audacity was breathtaking. She was under federal investigation for fraud, and she was asking me to give her access to what little credit I had left. Sarah, I said slowly, I can't do that. What do you mean you can't do that? It's not going to cost you anything. We just need to put a payment through, and then we'll pay it off immediately. I mean I can't do that. I won't do that. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if she'd hung up. Mom, are you okay? You sound strange. I know what you've been doing, Sarah. Another long silence. I don't know what you mean. I know about the FBI investigation. I know about the investors you've been stealing from. I know the businesses you've described to me don't exist. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, colder, more calculating. What have you been talking to? Who's been filling your head with these ridiculous ideas? The bank statements don't lie, Sarah. The transaction records don't lie. You hired someone to investigate me? The disbelief in her voice was almost comical. Your own daughter? My own daughter has been stealing from me for years. I haven't stolen anything. Everything I've taken from you has been a loan, and you'll get every penny back with interest once this investigation is resolved. Even now, faced with evidence of her crimes, she was lying. There is no business, Sarah. There never was. You've been running a Ponzi scheme, and the money you took from me was used to defraud other people. That's absolutely not true, and I can't believe you'd accuse your own daughter of something so horrible. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost doubted what I knew to be true. This was how she'd manipulated me for years, making me feel guilty for doubting her, ashamed for not trusting her, responsible for her financial problems. I'm not going to argue with you about this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not giving you any more money. I'm not co-signing any more loans. I'm not adding you to my credit cards. It's over. You can't do this to me, Mom. I'm your daughter. Family doesn't abandon family. Family doesn't steal from family either, I thought but didn't say. Where am I supposed to get the money I need? You're going to ruin everything I've worked for. Everything she'd worked for. The delusion was remarkable. I've worked for 30 years as a home health aide to save the money you've stolen from me, I said. I've sacrificed my health, my security, my future because I believed in you. But I won't sacrifice my integrity by helping you steal from other families. I can't believe you're doing this to me. I'm not doing anything to you, Sarah. I'm finally stopping you from doing things to me. She hung up. I sat in my kitchen, shaking, feeling like I'd just survived some kind of natural disaster. The silence in my apartment felt different, not empty, but peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring with another emergency, another request, another elaborate story designed to separate me from what little security I had left. But Sarah wasn't finished. The next afternoon, Michael called from Chicago, his voice tight with anger. "Mom, what's this about you hiring a private investigator to spy on Sarah?" My heart sank. "She called you. She's devastated, Mom. She says you've accused her of being some kind of criminal, that you've hired people to investigate her business." She's crying so hard she could barely get the words out. The manipulation was masterful. Sarah had turned the narrative completely around, making herself the victim of her suspicious, paranoid mother who'd hired strangers to invade her privacy and undermine her business. "Michael, did she tell you about the FBI investigation?" "What FBI investigation? Mom, what are you talking about?" So Sarah had conveniently omitted that detail from her tearful call to her brother. I told Michael everything: the bank records, the non-existent businesses, the federal investigation, the evidence that his sister was running an elaborate fraud scheme. When I finished, Michael was quiet for a long time. "Jesus, Mom. Are you absolutely sure about this?" "As sure as I can be. The private investigator has documentation. The federal agents confirmed they're building a case. The bank statements show transactions that make no sense for any legitimate business. But why wouldn't she just ask us for help if she was in real trouble? Why create all these elaborate lies?" Because Sarah wasn't in trouble, she was trouble. But I didn't say that to Michael. He was still her brother, still struggling to reconcile the sister he'd grown up with and the criminal she'd apparently become. Over the next week, Sarah launched what I can only describe as a family campaign against me. She called my sister in Florida, sobbing about how I'd turned against her, hired investigators to destroy her reputation, and abandoned her just when her business was finally succeeding. She contacted my elderly brother in Phoenix, telling him I was suffering from dementia and making paranoid accusations that were threatening to ruin her career. She even reached out to some of my old friends from the hospital, claiming she was worried about my mental health and asking them to intervene. The web of lies was so intricate, so emotionally manipulative, that I started to doubt my own judgment. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for everything. Maybe my daughter really was just a struggling entrepreneur who'd gotten in over her head with some complicated business arrangements. But then Janet, my private investigator, called with news that erased any lingering doubts. "Mrs. Chen, I've been in contact with Agent Martinez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. They're planning to arrest your daughter next week." My legs gave out, and I had to sit down hard on my kitchen chair. "They've been building the case for months, gathering evidence of the various schemes she's been running. Your financial records actually helped them establish the timeline and scope of her activities." Am I in trouble? For giving her the money? "No, you're a victim, not an accomplice. But they may need you to testify about the lies she told you, the promises she made, and the way she manipulated you into funding her activities." Testify against my own daughter in federal court. The thought made me physically ill, but I knew it was necessary. Not just for justice, but for all the other families Sarah had victimized, all the other elderly parents who'd been manipulated and cheated by their own children. When will it happen? Friday morning. They'll arrest her at her apartment in Los Angeles. 3 days away. I spent those 3 days in a kind of suspended animation, unable to eat or sleep, jumping every time the phone rang, wondering if Sarah would call to confess, to apologize, to somehow explain how she'd become someone I didn't recognize. But she didn't call. On Friday morning, I sat by my window, looking out at the gray Bronx sky, knowing that somewhere in Los Angeles, federal agents were knocking on my daughter's door. The call came at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. "Mrs. Chen, this is Agent Martinez with the FBI. I'm calling to let you know that Sarah Chen was arrested this morning on charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. She's being held pending arraignment." I thanked him and hung up the phone. My daughter was in jail. The woman I'd given birth to, raised, loved, sacrificed everything for, was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in prison. And all I felt was relief. That afternoon, the phone started ringing. Michael, calling from Chicago with the news. My sister, confused and upset, wanting to know if it was true. Friends who'd seen the arrest reported on the local news. But the call that surprised me came that evening. "Mrs. Chen? This is Detective Ray Sullivan with the LAPD. I'm working with the federal task force on your daughter's case, and I have some information you might want to know." "What kind of information?" We executed a search warrant on her apartment today, and we found some things that suggest her fraud schemes were even more extensive than we originally thought. My heart sank. How much worse could it get? We found surveillance equipment in her apartment. Hidden cameras, recording devices, and a computer system that was being used to monitor and record conversations with her victims. I don't understand. Your daughter was recording her phone conversations with investors and family members. We think she was using these recordings to gather personal information that helped her manipulate people more effectively. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Every conversation I'd had with Sarah over the past few years, every moment I'd shared my fears about money or health or loneliness, had been recorded. My private pain had been used as data to help her steal from me more efficiently. There's something else, Detective Sullivan continued. We found evidence that she was planning to take out life insurance policies on several family members, including you. The room started spinning. Life insurance policies? Large policies, where she would be the beneficiary. She hadn't actually filed the applications yet, but we found the documentation and preliminary paperwork. I hung up the phone and ran to the bathroom, where I vomited until my stomach was empty. My daughter hadn't just been stealing from me, she'd been planning to profit from my death. That night, I called Mr. Morrison, my lawyer, and told him about the recordings and the life insurance plans. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to discuss getting you some protection. Not physical protection, I don't think you're in any immediate danger, but financial and legal protection. We need to make sure Sarah can never access any of your accounts or personal information again. Over the next week, Mr. Morrison helped me change every password, close every joint account, and revoke every power of attorney that had Sarah's name on it. We put security freezes on my credit reports, changed the locks on my apartment, and even got me a new phone number. It was like erasing my daughter from my life, deleting her access to every aspect of my existence that she'd used to exploit me. The process should have felt empowering, but mostly it just felt sad. Sarah's arraignment was the following Monday. Michael flew in from Chicago, and we sat in the federal courthouse in Manhattan, watching as my daughter, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, entered a plea of not guilty to 17 federal charges. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair lank and unwashed, her face pale and drawn. When her eyes found mine in the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen before: fear. Real fear, not the manufactured desperation she'd used to manipulate me over the years. For just a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to have nightmares and crawl into my bed for comfort. Then her lawyer whispered something in her ear, and her expression hardened. When she looked at me again, there was something cold and calculating in her eyes, something that made me glad for the bulletproof glass that separated the gallery from the defendant's table. After the hearing, Michael and I sat in a coffee shop near the courthouse, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. I keep thinking there has to be some explanation, Michael said, stirring his coffee absently. Some reason why she did all this that makes sense. Some people are just broken, I said, surprising myself with how matter-of-fact I sounded. Sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never imagined. But she's our sister. She's your daughter. No, I said quietly. The person in that courtroom isn't my daughter. My daughter died years ago, and I just didn't realize it. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. Sarah's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea bargain, but the federal prosecutors weren't interested in reducing charges. They had too much evidence, too many victims, and they wanted to send a message about elder fraud. Over the winter, I testified before a grand jury, answering questions about the years of manipulation and theft. It was humiliating and painful, but also strangely cathartic. For the first time in my adult life, I was telling the truth about my relationship with my daughter. No more excuses, no more lies to protect her reputation, no more pretending that her behavior was normal or acceptable. The other victims began reaching out to me through the federal prosecutor's office. There was Margaret, a 78-year-old widow from San Diego who'd given Sarah $40,000 for a supposed movie investment. There was Robert, a retired teacher from Phoenix who'd mortgaged his house to fund what he thought was a technology startup. All of us had been told similar lies, made similar promises, manipulated with similar emotional techniques. We formed a support group of sorts, comparing stories, sharing our shame and anger and grief for the people we'd thought we were helping. The hardest part was accepting that we hadn't been unlucky or naive, we'd been targeted. Sarah had specifically looked for elderly people with money and emotional vulnerabilities, then systematically exploited both. I was just her most convenient victim because I was her mother. The trial began in March. Day after day, Michael and I sat in the federal courthouse, listening to prosecutors detail the scope and sophistication of Sarah's schemes. She'd created fake websites for non-existent companies, forged contracts with major studios, and even hired actors to play the roles of successful business partners during video calls with potential investors. The whole thing was so elaborate, so carefully planned, that I almost felt proud of her intelligence and creativity, until I remembered that every dollar she'd stolen had come from families like ours, people who'd trusted their children and grandchildren with their life savings. Sarah's defense was that she genuinely believed her various business ventures would succeed, that she'd never intended to defraud anyone, that the money she'd taken was investment capital, not theft. But the recordings found in her apartment told a different story. We listened to phone calls where she laughed about her stupid investors, where she coached accomplices on how to manipulate elderly victims, where she calculated exactly how much money she could extract from each family member before they became suspicious. In one particularly damning recording, she talked about me. "The old lady will give me whatever I ask for," her voice said through the courtroom speakers. "I just have to cry a little bit and mention how hard I'm working to make her proud. She's so desperate to believe I'm successful that she'll mortgage her future to fund mine." Hearing my own daughter describe me as "the old lady" broke something inside me that I didn't know could be broken. When it was my turn to testify, I looked directly at Sarah as I described the years of manipulation and theft. She wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at her hands folded on the defendant's table. I told the jury about skipping meals to send her money, about canceling my health insurance to pay for her business expenses, about lying awake nights worrying about how I'd pay for my medications while sending her thousands of dollars for opportunities that didn't exist. "Did you ever suspect that your daughter was lying to you?" the prosecutor asked. "I didn't want to suspect," I answered honestly. "She was my daughter. I wanted to believe that everything I'd sacrificed for her was helping her build a successful life." What would you say to other elderly parents who might be in similar situations? I thought about Margaret and Robert and all the other victims sitting in the courtroom gallery. I'd say that love doesn't require you to bankrupt yourself. If your own children are willing to steal your security, your future, your peace of mind, they're not the people you raised them to be. And you don't owe them your destruction. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all 17 counts, Sarah finally looked at me. There were no tears, no remorse, no acknowledgement of what she'd done to our family. Just a cold, appraising stare that seemed to be calculating whether I might still be useful to her somehow. The judge sentenced her to 18 years in federal prison. As they led her away in handcuffs, she turned back and spoke to me for the first time since her arrest. "This is your fault," she said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "If you hadn't hired those investigators, none of this would have happened." Even facing 18 years in prison, she still believed she was the victim. After the sentencing, Michael and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright spring sunshine. The cherry trees along the street were blooming, and the air smelled like hope instead of the stale recycled atmosphere of the courtroom. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "Now I go home and try to remember who I was before I became someone who could be victimized by her own daughter." It wasn't easy. For months, I jumped every time the phone rang, expecting another crisis, another emergency, another request for money. I'd trained myself to be available to Sarah 24 hours a day for so many years that I didn't know how to live without that constant anxiety. But slowly, life began to change. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped checking my bank account compulsively every morning, terrified of what unauthorized transactions I might find. I bought myself new clothes for the first time in years, not designer outfits, but clean, pretty things that made me feel human again. Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor, invited me to join her weekly card game, and I said yes. The other women were kind and funny, and they treated me like I was interesting, like my opinions mattered, like I was more than just a source of financial support for someone else's dreams. I started volunteering at the senior center downtown, helping other elderly people navigate bureaucratic systems and avoid scams. It felt good to use my hard-won experience to protect other families from what mine had endured. And gradually, I began to understand that Sarah hadn't stolen just money from me, she'd stolen my sense of self-worth, my ability to trust my own judgment, my belief that I deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. Getting those things back took longer than recovering financially, but it was more important. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from Sarah in prison. For a moment, holding the envelope, I felt that old familiar tug of maternal responsibility. Maybe she was sorry. Maybe she'd finally realized what she'd done to our family. Maybe she wanted to apologize and try to rebuild some kind of relationship. I almost threw the letter away without reading it. But curiosity won, and I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Sarah's careful handwriting. It started with complaints about prison conditions and moved on to detailed explanations of why her conviction had been a miscarriage of justice. She wrote about appeals and new evidence and legal strategies that would eventually vindicate her. She talked about the book she was writing about her experience, the movie rights she was negotiating, the speaking tour she planned to do about prosecutorial overreach. Even in federal prison, she was running scams. The letter ended with a request for money for her commissary account and a suggestion that I start a crowdfunding campaign to help with her legal expenses. I read the entire letter twice, then put it in my kitchen drawer next to the notebook where I'd recorded all her lies over the years. I never wrote back. That night, I cooked myself a real dinner, not canned soup or day-old bread, but salmon and vegetables and rice, food that tasted like I deserved to eat well. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by my window, watching the sun set over the Bronx. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Michael calls me every Sunday now, not because he needs anything, but because he wants to talk to his mother. We discuss books and movies and his job and his friends. Sometimes we talk about Sarah, but not as often as you might think. She's become like a relative who died years ago, someone we remember, but who no longer has the power to shape our present or future. The other day, I was cleaning out my closet and found a box of old photos. Pictures of Sarah as a baby, as a toddler, as a young woman full of dreams and possibilities. I looked at those images for a long time, trying to find some sign of the person she would become, some hint of the capacity for cruelty and manipulation that would eventually define her. But all I saw was a little girl who smiled when she was happy and cried when she was sad, who hugged me tight when she was scared and danced around the living room when her favorite song came on the radio. I don't know when or how that little girl disappeared. I don't know if she was broken by something that happened to her, or if she broke herself by choosing the easy path of deception over the hard work of building a legitimate life. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that I survived her, that I reclaimed my life and my dignity and my future. What matters is that other families might be spared what we endured because Sarah is in prison and can't hurt anyone else for the next 18 years. What matters is that I learned the difference between love and enablement, between supporting someone's dreams and financing their delusions. I am 74 years old. I have arthritis and diabetes and a small social security check that barely covers my basic expenses. But I also have my integrity, my independence, and my self-respect. Sarah took a lot from me, but she didn't take everything. And what I have left is enough to build the rest of my life on. Last week, I received a letter from Margaret, the widow from San Diego who was one of Sarah's other victims. She started a non-profit organization to educate elderly people about family financial exploitation. She asked if I'd be willing to share my story, to help other parents recognize the signs of manipulation before they lose everything to their own children. I said yes. Not because I enjoy reliving the pain, but because silence protects predators. Because someone needs to say out loud that family relationships should be based on mutual respect, not one-sided exploitation. Because love shouldn't cost you your future. Today I'm going to record a video for Margaret's website, telling my story to other elderly parents who might be struggling with adult children who see them as resources rather than relatives. It won't be easy to share such personal pain with strangers. But if my experience can save even one family from what we went through, it will be worth it. The little girl in those old photographs deserved better parents than she got. The elderly woman Sarah victimized deserved a better daughter than she raised. But the woman I am today, the survivor who refused to be destroyed by her own child's greed, deserves to use her voice to protect other families from the kind of betrayal that nearly broke her. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Since the trial ended, I've received hundreds of letters from other families who've experienced similar betrayals. Each story is unique in its details, but the patterns are frighteningly similar. Adult children who exploit their parents' love and trust, who use emotional manipulation to drain life savings accounts, who disappear when their crimes are discovered only to return with new schemes and fresh demands. There's Maria from San Antonio, whose son convinced her to sell her house and give him the proceeds for a restaurant that never opened. There's Frank from Detroit, whose daughter forged his signature on loan documents and left him facing foreclosure at 82. There's Dorothy from Portland, whose grandson emptied her retirement account through electronic transfers she never authorized. All of us carried the same shame, the same self-doubt, the same crushing weight of wondering how we'd failed so completely as parents that our own children could treat us as marks to be conned rather than family members to be cherished. But through our shared stories, we've learned that we weren't failures, we were victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation by people who understood our vulnerabilities better than we understood them ourselves. The healing process has been slow and sometimes painful. There are days when I wake up and for just a moment forget that Sarah is in prison, when I reach for my phone to call her with some small piece of news before remembering that the daughter I thought I knew never really existed. There are moments when I see other elderly mothers with their adult children in restaurants or parks, watching them laugh together over shared memories, and I feel a stab of envy so sharp it takes my breath away. But there are also moments of profound gratitude, for the truth that finally set me free, for the remaining family members who've rallied around me, for the new friends who've entered my life since I stopped organizing my entire existence around Sarah's endless crises. Mrs. Rodriguez's card game has become the highlight of my week. The women are all widows like me, survivors of various life catastrophes who've learned to find joy in small pleasures and comfort in each other's company. We play for pennies and laugh until our sides ache, sharing stories and recipes and complaints about our arthritis with the easy intimacy of people who've stopped pretending that life is anything other than complicated and beautiful and hard. I've started taking watercolor classes at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when every free moment was spent worrying about Sarah's latest financial emergency. My paintings are terrible, wobbly landscapes and lopsided flowers that look more like abstract art than anything recognizable, but the act of creating something purely for my own pleasure feels revolutionary after so many years of existing solely for someone else's benefit. The senior center where I volunteer has become a second home. I help other elderly people fill out forms for government benefits and understand the increasingly complex healthcare system that seems designed to confuse and intimidate anyone over 65. But more importantly, I've become part of an informal network of people who watch for signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Just last month, I helped identify a case where an elderly man's nephew was systematically stealing his Social Security checks. The nephew had convinced his uncle that he was investing the money for him, but in reality was using it to fund a gambling addiction. We were able to connect the uncle with legal services and get the nephew prosecuted before he could drain what little savings remained. Each time we save someone from what I went through, I feel like Sarah's crime serves some small purpose, like my pain wasn't completely meaningless if it can prevent others from experiencing the same betrayal. The most surprising development in this new phase of my life has been reconnecting with Michael's children, my grandchildren, whom I'd been too ashamed to see regularly when my financial situation was so desperate. Emma is 15 now, smart and funny and full of opinions about everything from climate change to social media. James is 12, quieter but intensely curious about the world around him. For years, I declined invitations to visit them in Chicago because I couldn't afford the plane ticket and was too proud to ask Michael to pay for it. Now I fly to Chicago every few months, using the small amounts of money I've managed to save since I stopped funding Sarah's schemes. The kids don't know the full details of what their aunt did. Michael and I decided they're too young to understand the complexity of the situation, but they know that their grandmother went through a difficult time and is doing better now. Emma asked me recently why I seemed so different from how she remembered me, why I laughed more and seemed less worried all the time. I told her that sometimes we have to learn hard lessons about who we can trust and who we can't, and that while those lessons are painful, they can also set us free to be happier than we were before. She nodded with the solemn wisdom that teenagers sometimes display and said, "I'm glad you learned that lesson, Grandma. You seem more like yourself now. More like myself." The observation hit me with unexpected force because it was so accurate and yet so heartbreaking. For years, I hadn't been myself. I'd been a version of myself shaped by Sarah's needs, Sarah's crises, Sarah's endless demands. I'd forgotten that I had interests and opinions and desires that existed independently of my daughter's approval or disapproval. The process of rediscovering who I am beneath the layers of manipulation and codependency has been like archaeological excavation, carefully brushing away decades of accumulated deception to uncover the person I used to be, and more importantly, the person I can still become. I've started reading again, something I'd abandoned when every spare moment was spent worrying about money or waiting for Sarah's next call. I work my way through novels and memoirs and books about history, losing myself in other people's stories in a way that feels both familiar and revolutionary. I've even started writing, keeping a journal that captures not just the events of my days but my thoughts and feelings about this strange new life I'm building. Some entries are painful, processing the grief and anger and disappointment that come with accepting the truth about Sarah. Others are hopeful, documenting small discoveries and moments of unexpected joy. But what strikes me most as I read back through these journal entries is how much more space there is in my life now. Space for thoughts that aren't about crisis management, for conversations that aren't about problem solving, for activities that exist purely because they bring me pleasure rather than because they serve someone else's agenda. The financial recovery has been slower but steady. The federal restitution order requires Sarah to repay her victims, but since she has no legitimate assets, the actual payments are minimal, maybe $50 a month that comes from her prison job making license plates for 70 cents an hour. It's more symbolic than substantive, but there's something satisfying about knowing that she's required to contribute something, however small, toward repairing the damage she caused. More practically, I've been able to rebuild my small emergency fund by living frugally and taking advantage of senior discounts and community resources I was too proud to use when I was still trying to maintain the fiction that everything was fine with my daughter. I shop at the senior center's food pantry, where volunteers sort donations from local supermarkets and distribute fresh produce and pantry staples to anyone over 60 who needs them. I ride the senior shuttle bus to medical appointments instead of taking expensive taxi rides. I've learned about prescription assistance programs that help cover the cost of my diabetes medication. These aren't luxurious solutions, but they're dignified ones that allow me to maintain my independence without bankrupting myself or relying on family members who have their own financial responsibilities. The hardest adjustment has been learning to make decisions based on my own needs rather than anticipating Sarah's next emergency. For years, every choice I made, from what groceries to buy to whether I could afford a new winter coat, was filtered through the question of whether I might need that money for Sarah's latest crisis. Now, when I want to treat myself to dinner at the Italian restaurant down the street, I don't have to calculate whether that $20 might be needed for some imaginary business emergency. When my old television finally dies and I decide to replace it, I don't have to worry that Sarah might call tomorrow needing exactly the amount I spent on the new TV. The freedom is intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. After so many years of living in crisis mode, the absence of constant anxiety feels almost unnatural. But I'm learning to trust that this peace is real, that I've earned it through some of the hardest decisions I've ever made, and that I deserve to enjoy the remaining years of my life without the shadow of Sarah's chaos hanging over everything. The question I'm asked most often by other families going through similar situations is whether I miss Sarah, whether I regret turning her in to the authorities, whether I would do things differently if I could go back. The answer is complicated. I miss the daughter I thought I had. I miss the relationship I thought we shared. I miss the version of Sarah who existed in my imagination, the struggling but honest entrepreneur who was working hard to build something meaningful and just needed a little help from her mother to make her dreams come true. But I don't miss the reality of what our relationship actually was, a one-sided emotional and financial transaction where I provided resources and she provided just enough affection and false hope to keep the pipeline flowing. I don't miss the sleepless nights spent worrying about bills I couldn't pay because I'd sent my last $100 to someone who was using it to defraud other families. I don't miss the panic attacks, the constant anxiety, the growing realization that something was deeply wrong but I was too afraid to look closely enough to see what it was. And I definitely don't regret reporting her crimes to the authorities. Not just because it was the right thing to do for her other victims, but because it was the right thing to do for her. Sarah needed to face consequences for her actions, needed to understand that she couldn't continue hurting people without paying a price. The fact that she's used her time in prison to blame everyone except herself for her situation suggests that she still hasn't learned that lesson, but that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to the 2 grandchildren who need to see their grandmother model healthy boundaries and self-respect. My responsibility is to the other elderly parents who might benefit from hearing that it's possible to survive your own child's betrayal and build a meaningful life afterward. My responsibility is to myself, to the woman who spent 7 decades learning to be strong and independent and who refuses to spend her final years being anyone's victim. There are still moments of profound sadness. Holidays are the hardest, when the absence of the relationship I thought I had with Sarah feels most acute. I see other families gathering for Christmas or Thanksgiving, taking for granted the simple pleasure of being surrounded by children and grandchildren who genuinely love them, and I feel the weight of what I've lost. But I've also learned to create new traditions that celebrate what I've gained rather than mourn what I've lost. Last Christmas, instead of spending the day alone with my regrets, I volunteered at a shelter serving holiday meals to homeless families. The work was exhausting but rewarding, and the gratitude of the families we served reminded me that there are many ways to find meaning and connection beyond the traditional family structures I'd always assumed were the only path to happiness. This year, I'm planning to spend Thanksgiving with Margaret and some of the other victims from Sarah's case who've become close friends. We're calling it Friendsgiving and planning to share not just a meal but our stories of recovery and renewal. It won't replace the family holiday I'd always imagined, but it will be real and honest and free from the undertones of manipulation and resentment that had poisoned so many gatherings with Sarah. The legal process isn't completely finished. Sarah's appeals are still working their way through the federal court system, though her lawyers have warned her that the evidence against her was so overwhelming that the chances of overturning her conviction are minimal. Occasionally, reporters contact me for updates on the case or comments about elder fraud in general. I've learned to be selective about which interviews I accept, focusing on opportunities to educate other families rather than sensationalizing my personal tragedy. Last month, I appeared on a panel at a community college symposium about financial crimes against seniors. Sitting beside law enforcement officials and social workers, I told my story to an audience of adult children and elderly parents, many of whom were struggling with their own family financial issues. The reaction was powerful and sometimes emotional. Several people approached me afterward to share their own experiences or ask for advice about situations they suspected might be similar to what I'd endured. One woman, probably in her 50s, told me through tears that her mother had been giving thousands of dollars to her brother for years to support what he claimed was a consulting business, but the family had never seen any evidence that the business existed. "I've been trying to convince Mom to stop giving him money," she said, "but she keeps saying he's her son and she has to help him. How do I make her understand that he's taking advantage of her?" I thought about my own journey from enabler to victim to survivor, about all the people who'd tried to warn me about Sarah's behavior and how I'd dismissed their concerns as interference or jealousy. "You can't make her understand," I told her. "She has to come to that realization herself. But you can plant seeds of doubt, ask pointed questions, and be ready to support her when she's ready to see the truth." I gave her my phone number and told her to call if her mother ever wanted to talk to someone who'd been through something similar. These conversations are difficult but necessary. The statistics on elder financial abuse are staggering. Experts estimate that older Americans lose more than $30 billion annually to various scams and fraudulent schemes, with family members being responsible for a significant percentage of those crimes. The shame and embarrassment that keep victims silent also protect perpetrators, allowing them to continue their schemes and find new victims. Every story shared, every truth told, every boundary drawn makes it slightly harder for these predators to operate. I think about the other elderly parents out there right now, lying awake at 3 a.m. worrying about adult children whose stories don't quite add up, whose financial emergencies seem to occur with suspicious regularity, whose promises of repayment never materialize. Some of those parents are making excuses, as I did for years, telling themselves that love requires infinite patience and financial support. Others are beginning to suspect the truth but don't know how to confront it without destroying their relationships with their children. To those parents, I want to say, your love should not cost you your security. Your sacrifice should not be infinite. Your trust, once broken, does not have to be automatically rebuilt just because the person who broke it shares your DNA. Family relationships, like all relationships, should involve mutual respect, reciprocal care, and honest communication. When those elements are missing, when the relationship becomes exclusively about what you can provide rather than who you are as a person, it's not a family relationship anymore, it's exploitation dressed up in the language of love. The hardest truth I've had to accept is that Sarah was comfortable exploiting me not despite being my daughter, but because she was my daughter. She understood my vulnerabilities, my fears, my desires better than any stranger could. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to press to override my logical objections to her increasingly unreasonable requests. The fact that she used that intimate knowledge to manipulate and steal from me makes her crimes more cruel, not less. The fact that she targeted me specifically because she knew I would sacrifice my own well-being for her happiness makes her actions more calculating, not more forgivable. Understanding this has been crucial to my recovery because it's helped me stop blaming myself for being foolish or gullible. I wasn't fooled by a stranger's sophisticated con game, I was betrayed by someone who had lifelong access to my emotions and used that access to destroy my financial security. That's not a failure of judgment on my part, it's a failure of character on hers. The difference between those two things has taken me years to understand, but it's made all the difference in how I see myself and my future. I am not a foolish old woman who was easily duped by transparent lies. I am a loving mother who was systematically manipulated by her own child over the course of several years using intimate knowledge of my psychology and my financial situation. I am not responsible for being victimized. I am responsible for recognizing what happened, protecting myself from further harm, and using my experience to help prevent other families from enduring the same betrayal. That distinction has allowed me to hold Sarah accountable for her actions while also holding myself accountable for my recovery. Some days are harder than others. There are moments when I catch myself automatically checking my phone for messages from Sarah before remembering that she can't contact me and I don't want her to. There are times when I see news stories about successful young entrepreneurs and feel a pang of grief for the daughter I thought I was supporting all those years. But increasingly, those moments of sadness are balanced by moments of genuine contentment and even joy. Yesterday, I spent the afternoon teaching Emma how to make my grandmother's apple pie recipe, the same recipe I'd taught Sarah when she was Emma's age. Emma listened carefully to my instructions about the importance of keeping the butter cold and not overworking the dough, and when the pie came out of the oven golden and fragrant, she hugged me tight and said it was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. In that moment, standing in Michael's kitchen with flour on my hands and the scent of apples and cinnamon filling the air, I felt connected to a chain of women stretching back generations. My grandmother who'd taught me this recipe during the Depression, my mother who'd refined it over decades of Sunday dinners, myself as a young mother patiently guiding Sarah's small hands as she learned to crimp the edge of the pie crust. The tradition continues, passed from my hands to Emma's, carrying with it all the love and knowledge and resilience that my family has passed down for generations. Sarah's betrayal couldn't destroy that legacy, it just redirected it towards someone who will honor it rather than exploit it. That's the real victory in this long, painful story. Not that justice was served, though it was. Not that I recovered financially, though I have to some degree. The real victory is that I remembered who I am beyond my relationship to Sarah, and I've been able to pass that knowledge on to the next generation. I am a survivor, but I'm also a grandmother, a volunteer, a friend, a student, a woman still learning and growing at 74. I am someone with stories to tell and skills to share and love to give to people who will appreciate it rather than exploit it. Sarah took some things from me that I'll never get back. My life savings, my sense of family security, my faith in my own judgment. But she couldn't take everything. She couldn't take my resilience, my capacity for growth, my ability to find meaning and purpose even in the aftermath of betrayal. And those are the things that matter most as I write the next chapters of my life. Tell me, have you ever lived something like this? Have you known someone who was manipulated by their own family member? Please share your story in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can help protect other families from the kind of betrayal that changes everything. Because sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we love the most. And sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to say no.